Dawie Roodt, economist, now with us about the mini budget today. So, what's your reaction, Dawie?
Well, my reaction, Linda, I guess, is boring, 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 boring. And that's exactly what we expected. And that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. There are, of course, one or two highlights. I think the highlight of highlights is certainly that Minister of Finance eventually decided to reduce the inflation targets to 3%. That is a very good thing. He didn't have much of a choice. The Reserve Bank really forced him into lowering the inflation targets because the Reserve Bank basically said we are targeting 3% in any event. So yes, he reduced that, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on state-owned enterprises and the various authorities, local authorities, and even on the Minister of Finance himself, by the way. Because if you look at his estimates on state expenditure over the next couple of years, he actually wanted to spend much more than inflation, and now we're going to tell him, listen, you can't spend more. You can't increase your expenditure more than the inflation rate. But anyway, so inflation is the big thing, without a doubt. One or two other things, but again, that was pretty much expected. So economic growth is reduced to 1.2%. That's exactly what I expected the minister to do. I think it's still a little bit optimistic. I think it's going to be a little bit less than that, but 1.2, that's the number. Overrun the state revenue, about 20 billion. That's what he says. I think it's going to be a little bit better than that. But again, that was pretty much expected. And then certain ratios like the deficit and the debt ratios, and those are all kind of stabilizing. And I think that is the good news. So the underlying good news is that the fiscal numbers like the debt and deficit numbers seem to be stabilizing. The primary deficit or the primary surplus actually is a little bit bigger than what we've expected. And with a bit of luck, this could be the turning point as far as the fiscal accounts are concerned. There's a lot of work still. We need much, much stronger economic growth. We need much more discipline from the fiscal authorities. But with a bit of luck, maybe this could be the turning point. And if you look at the reaction by the financial markets reckon that is indeed the case. The rand strengthened, the capital market strengthened, even the equities did much, much better. And I think there is a possibility even of a slightly better rating from the rating agencies because of this. So we're not out of the woods yet, but mostly good news, I would say. And boring.
Well, boring is never bad because, it means things are not going wrong. So, do you think that there's a good chance that there might be a rating improvement at the end of this week?
I don't think a rating improvement necessarily, but perhaps the outlook could be turned to positive. At the moment, the major rating agencies, they've got us on a neutral outlook. So I think they could change that to a positive outlook. But of course, this is the medium-term budget policy statement. It's not a budget. The budget, we have to wait for the budget in February. The previous budget, beginning of this year, was a real circus. So let's see if they can actually pull it off to have a budget actually in February. But yes, there certainly is a possibility that the outlook could be turned to positive.
So, you hinted a little bit that this might be a turnaround. I see there's been quite big voices saying that this is a turnaround in South Africa. What did you think of all the comments?
Well, turnaround, it's a big word, it's a strong word, because if you really want to turn the fiscal accounts around, remember we're talking about fiscal debt to GDP that's close to 80% of GDP. If you include the state-owned enterprises and some other entities, then the actual debt to GDP ratio is in fact actually close to 100% of GDP. We are in very, very deep trouble when it comes to things like, for example, the debt to GDP ratio, and we are heading for a financial crisis if we continue like this. Now, how do you fix this? And the only really sustainable way of fixing this is to get stronger economic growth. Now, if you talk about 1.2% economic growth, that is just not good enough. It is just not good enough. I know the Minister of Finance, he reckons economic growth will accelerate to close to 2% over the next 2 or 3 years or so, but even 2% is not good enough. So that is really the wild card. That is the outstanding issue, and that's something that we need to address. Economic growth need to be much stronger to really support the fiscal accounts. But without a doubt, the Minister of Finance is really doing what he can in a very weak growth environment. But economic growth needs to be addressed, and it needs to be much stronger. 1.2% is just not good enough.
But wasn't this quite surprising given what's going on at the moment with the pressure on South Africa from the US with tariffs? Isn't this then quite surprising that it looks quite good?
No. Everything was expected. There's no single number that I did not expect. Everything was in the market. Economic growth, if we can perhaps just talk about that a little bit. Remember, the Minister of Finance told us that economic growth is going to be 1.9% at the beginning of this year. Now, everybody knew that's not going to be, that's not going to happen. And I still think 1.2% even is too strong. But if you look at all the other numbers, there is not one single number that came as a surprise to me. Everything was pretty much expected. So why the financial markets actually reacted quite positive to this really beats me, because there's nothing new to me, but I guess that is exactly what we wanted. We didn't want any surprises.
And the minister also announced a new tax administration reform strategy, or TARS, aimed at improving tax collection.
Yes, what is quite interesting to me is not only that, what the Minister of Finance is actually saying, and he's saying this publicly. And perhaps that's something we can talk about a little bit more. And he's telling everybody how the private sector is getting involved in state-owned enterprises, at various state-owned enterprises. And he's actually quite, he's boasting about that. And that perhaps is a bit of a deviation from previous policies. Previously, the ANC or government did not want to get private sector participation in the state-owned enterprises, and now they're actually actively supporting that and encouraging that. And I guess that's also a good news story.
Does it mean it's a good news story for the GNU as well?
Yeah, we're supposed to have a budget in February, and we've got a new political environment, new political sort of players in South Africa. The Minister of Finance need to be aware of that, and he needs to take their views into consideration as well. The beginning of this year, as we know, it was a serious circus with all the political parties trying to get the budget through, and the to and fro about the increase in the value-added tax and things like that. But I do think the Minister of Finance certainly spoke to his colleagues in the other political parties as well, and I think we all learned a very important lesson, especially the politicians. So I think this time around we're not going to see the same sort of shenanigans happening in trying to get the budget passed. I think this time around the Minister of Finance will make sure he will have his colleagues and the opposition parties, or his coalition partners at least, on the same side before he actually presents the actual budget, which should happen somewhere in February with a bit of luck. So I think we all learned a very important lesson, including the ANC, learning to work with their alliance partners as well.
Well, what's quite obvious in South Africa is how many of the government departments aren't working as well. But if there's one that's really working well, is SARS. So what effect does that have on the economy?
It's not only SARS working very well, the South African Reserve Bank is doing an excellent job as well. But yes, you're absolutely right. The revenue services are very efficient in South Africa, and they're getting very, very aggressive, and they're really squeezing the private sector to get every drop of blood out of the private sector. And that's part of the reason why the Minister of Finance, despite a weak economy, actually expects a bit of an overrun in tax collections. Now, I guess from a fiscal point of view, that's not bad news. That's good news, because the fiscal accounts are in deep trouble. But the reality is that if you take money away from the productive sector and give it to the unproductive sector, you are wasting money. And that is essentially what is happening. Apart from that, the tax burden on the private sector in South Africa is simply excessive. And that's not good news for economic growth. People are very actively, aggressively doing whatever they can to pay as little tax as possible, simply because the tax burden is just too high. So yes, from a financial point of view or from a fiscal point of view, SARS is doing a good job. But if you look at it in terms of economic growth, and you look at it in terms of the savings levels in economy, entrepreneurship in the economy, and that sort of things, it is not good news for us. What we need to do, we should have a very efficient SARS, definitely so, but we must reduce our tax burden on the economy. It is simply excessive, and the productive sectors in the economy, that part of the economy that keeps the economy ticking along, that part of the economy simply cannot carry this massive tax burden anymore.
Yeah, recently they also made it more difficult to take money out of the country.
Yeah, but there's some technological changes as well. Yes, SARS need to approve. I know this because I need to apply at SARS and at the South African Reserve Bank for my clients if we want to take money out of the country. So I am very much aware about how difficult it is to take money out of the country. But the reality is, although we have foreign exchange regulations in South Africa, the reality is that because of new technologies, like, for example, US dollar stable coins and blockchain technology, it is possible to take as much money out of the country as you want to. So I think, yes, although we have foreign exchange regulations in South Africa, that is only in paper, because in reality it's very easy to simply ignore that and to take money out of the country, and it's all still legal.
Well, Dawie Roodt, the economist on South Africa, thank you so much.
Thank you.